So welcome everyone to this block's Meet an Expert session, and we are very, very privileged to have our special guest, Dr. Mallika Sarma, from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And I'm sure that we're going to have a really, really interesting talk and learn about all sorts of things that Mallika's been working on and that will be of direct interest to all of you. So I'm just going to read out a short bio and then we'll get started. Mallika completed her PhD in anthropology with specialization in human biology at the University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, I think you might say it in the US.
Yeah.
She is currently a Translational Research Institute of Space Health Postdoctoral Fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the Human Spaceflight Lab. Her work focuses on biobehavioral adaptations to extreme environments, and her projects include assessing stress response, neurovestibular adaptation, and integrated multi-system physiology, with applications to clinical settings and the spaceflight environment. Mallika is also a sailing enthusiast, dancer, and competitive Olympic weightlifter. Wow. When not in the lab, you'll find her traveling or eating, and preferably doing both at the same time. So thank you very much, most sincerely, for coming along today. Can't wait to hear your talk. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to all of you today. I will be drinking some green tea because it's 8 p.m. here and I need to be awake. So give me a second. Let me share my screen. Okay, so just a couple of housekeeping items. If anyone has any questions, comments, I cannot see the chat box, so feel free to unmute, talk, say something. I am a very conversational presenter, and so if you want to go on a tangent and talk about something of interest, we can do that. Feel free to turn your videos on. I can see some of your videos, and I like to engage if that's something you're comfortable with. And I am going to do my best to keep the actual talking component of it pretty short so that we can have a really great discussion. Med students are always one of my favorite groups to talk to. You all are going to be practicing and in the field, and so I want to have a great discussion with all of you. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so when we think about humans living in space, we always have to think about what is our goal? What is our goal when we want to assess how humans can live, how they can get along in their everyday lives? What is health? What is medicine in this setting? So if we think far out enough, this is the future that we want. We want to have an interplanetary species. This is an artist mock-up of a couple of astronauts hanging out on the surface of Mars. And we know that today in 2022, the wheels for this are already in motion. The American mission, Artemis 1, which is going to be the first of many Artemis missions that are hoping to bring back humans to the moon. It's then serving as a gateway for the upcoming Mars missions. The first one will be launching actually in 2 weeks, which is very exciting, so mark your calendars. But we also know that the biggest challenge to interplanetary habitation is not, in fact, an engineering problem. Yes, the engineering is really hard. It's very difficult. There are many people who are doing the hard work of creating the engineering, but the issue is actually a human problem. We know that our species has taken a millennia to adapt the very different environments here on Earth, but trying to keep a group of humans alive on this outside the safe confines of our home planet is very difficult. A clear understanding of how humans will acclimate and adapt to these kinds of stressors of spaceflight and other celestial bodies like Mars or the moon can only be fully known once we arrive. And this honestly is pretty terrifying. But we do know that humans can survive and thrive in extreme environments. And we know that there are methods and mechanisms in which this happens. So from this, what do we do next? So first we want to look at what data we have available. Give me a second. There we go. When we think about humans in space right now, what data do we actually have? First, we know that humans have been living on the International Space Station. So we actually have over 2 decades of International Space Station data. If you were born after the year 2000, you have always lived with a continuous human presence in the space station, which is really, really incredible and cool. Now here, I don't know if anyone recognizes this vehicle. This is the SpaceX Dragon. It just went up for the Inspiration 4 launch back in September. It was the first all-civilian flight. Our lab had the great honor of being able to do some research on it. You can see the little cupola on top, and you can see there's like a person whose head sticking up right there. They added this cupola so people could actually, the passengers could see and enjoy the spaceflight presence. And this was a huge feat to be able to send 4 civilians up. So not scientists, not engineers, not military personnel, but civilians could go up by themselves. And the final is this really interesting looking plane. This is actually the Virgin Galactic plane. It went up, I think also back in August or September of last year. And so what is interesting about this plane is that it has the promise of changing regular spaceflight as we know it, spaceflight aerospace activities. And so transcontinental flights might be able to go on this suborbital plane and go really quickly. So in broad, we do have data. We do have some data on how humans are adapting to spaceflight, but they're all in these different settings. The amount of time that people are spending in these spaceflight, a capsule versus a plane versus the International Space Station are going to be different. Their physiological responses are different. Their behavior is different. So we take all of this data together and we come up with a model on how we can then best assess how humans will then adapt, how we can take care of them, and how they will live. Okay, so let me give a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll talk a little bit about myself and what I do and where my perspective comes from. As Dr. Christensen mentioned, my background is a little bit unique for this work. I came from a pretty hardcore behavioral background, and I made my way into physiology, and now I'm working in a clinical lab. And so the perspectives I bring, I think, are unique to the setting, but it's interesting because it feels like the perspectives I'm bringing are in alignment with the future of spaceflight and how we think about it. And we'll get more into that. Now, the second thing I'm going to talk about is stress and metabolism. So I know you're in your stress and metabolism quarter, and so we want to talk about that. But I want to present to you a theoretical perspective, and then at the end we'll do a Q&A. So as medical students, you're going to get plenty of information over the course of your classes talking about the specifics of metabolism and the stress response system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, all of the nitty-gritty stuff I am not going to get into here. But because I'm a human biologist, what I'm really excited to present to all of you is this conceptual framework on how we can maybe think about adaptations and why we measure stress and changes in stress and how that all might be worthwhile to metabolism. So my goal here, just in this little talk, is to present the landscape in which you all will eventually practice and how to balance all of these different needs against each other. The problem of spaceflight is extremely complex, and I'm going to present, by the end of this talk, I will basically present how difficult it is to basically get any data and any usable information that you have to move forward. But my argument is that the complexness and the complicatedness of human spaceflight is really what makes it fun. Okay, so a little bit about myself, my background, where I come from. So like Dr. Christensen said, I started at the University of Michigan, and my bachelor's was in evolutionary anthropology and psychology. And I finished my PhD work at the University of Notre Dame, again, with a focus on human biology. But what I really wanted to focus on was adaptation and acclimation to extreme environments. How do people do well in really bad places? Places that you don't think that they should do well, what's happening? How are they able to adapt to that? And the focuses that I took was looking at neuroendocrine and energetic and metabolic systems. And when I transitioned to the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, working first for the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and then moving on to the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which is attached to NASA. It's kind of like NASA's innovative funding arm. I like to call it their money laundering agency in a way. So I'm working as a postdoctoral fellow there. And here I'm taking all of the information that I know about stress response and energetics and how that is related to vestibular adaptation in spaceflight. And we can talk later, maybe during the Q&A, about vestibular function. Vestibular function is super critical to spaceflight, everyday spaceflight activity. You cannot get out of your vehicle if your vestibular system is messed up. And so we need to make sure that it's not going to be messed up if we're going to have people land on the moon, have people land on Mars, and then have to build a life there. So our Human Spaceflight Lab, this is just a couple of fun pictures. My undergrads and med students here had a lot of fun taking a photo shoot, so I felt that it was my obligation to show you how much fun they have working in the lab. But if you have any questions, if you're interested in more human spaceflight work, we have a journal club that is open to everyone. We have lots of med students, lots of graduate students, undergrads, faculty members, industry professionals who join this journal club. You can join our mailing list. If you just search Human Spaceflight Lab, Johns Hopkins, you'll be able to find it. Click the button. It's kind of cut off in this picture. It says join our mailing list. We'll get you added. Dr. Christensen has been a really wonderful member of this group, and we'd love to have any of you here too. Okay, let's get back to science. So the question that I'm interested in here is, how do humans survive and thrive in extreme environments? This has kind of driven all of my research and continues to drive the work that I look forward to doing human spaceflight. So first, when we're talking about an extreme environment, what is an extreme environment? What we're considering to be an extreme environment here is somewhere with highly intensive, environmentally driven or lifestyle-driven stressors that pose substantial challenges to the human body. Now, does that mean that, like, if you're in a high altitude setting, yes, that is going to be an extreme environment because of the hypoxia that you might encounter, because of the ruggedness of the environment, resource deprivement, but also if you're up at a high altitude location, you're up on top of a mountain, you're by yourself, like the psychosocial components of being there alone also make it an extreme environment. Now, the second thing is to looking at surviving and thriving. So this is not just basic physiological homeostasis, but also of interest is looking at positive growth, emergent properties, resilience. How can things be better? Where is room for improvement? If you stick around in the human spaceflight field, you'll see that resilience is a hot topic. People are very excited to understand how to be more resilient in space because space is really hard. So if you can create astronauts, if you can create scenarios where people can be more resilient, create resilient environments, you are helping everybody out. And finally, humans. So I always like to make this distinction. Here, humans are plural. Now, I am, again, a biological anthropologist, human biologist, and so all of my work is considering this, larger evolutionary framework about what makes human bodies the way that they are. And it's going to be very, very rare that you find any human in an environment by themselves, which is why we always have to look at humans in groups. Now, we know that groups can make things more complicated. There are costs and benefits to being with other people, but it's worthwhile to remember that when you are studying an individual, you have to consider the people that are around with them. So just because you're looking at one single crew member who is going maybe on a flight, the interactions that they're having with the rest of their crew are likely going to impact what is happening with their physiology, what is happening with their behavior. Now, my prior work has been looking at the relationships between environments and individuals in social and group contexts in a wide range of populations around the world, and it's all asking the same kind of questions. So in these extreme environments, and they're all extreme in very different ways, you can see working in high altitude Newbury, Nepal, so that's like very close, I would say on the other side of Nepal as Everest, but still having super, super high mountains. Central Congo Basin, working with hunter-gatherers, and then the American Rockies, where our high altitude, very cold environment. The question I'm interested in is, how do people do well? How are people doing well? How are they surviving? How are they thriving? And we can talk more about like all of this other crazy field work later in the Q&A portion as well. But one thing that is very cool that I have been able to do is bringing field research methods with lab methods. So working in extreme environments, it's extremely important to be able to be in that space and understand how the environment, the socio-political economic ecology, how the weather, how the groups of people interacting, all of these different things are going to be impacting a human body. So you're in space medicine, a very, very close analogous group is looking at wilderness medicine. If you get a chance, go take some wilderness medicine courses. You'll find that there's a lot of crossover there, because in the end, human spaceflight is still a wilderness terrain at this moment in time. Up until we are able to like build everything up, it is going to be treated much like a wilderness terrain. So some of the data I've been able to also collect on myself. This was couple, I guess around this time last year, I was a subject at High Seas, which is in Hawaii, and it is it's an analog site that is trying to be like the moon. And so I had the opportunity to be able to be like, oh, if I was an astronaut, this is the data we would be collecting. This is, how we would collect this data. The importance of being in that particular space is really important. But traveling around the world and collecting data, running experiments in the lab, it really becomes very clear. So humans are, one, excellent at adapting, and they use a variety of mechanisms. So you have your physiological adaptations, you have your genetic adaptations, but you also have your cultural, technological adaptations, and all of those things should be counted when you're thinking about how humans are adjusting to an environment. And while we don't know fully what we're getting into, as I mentioned before, until we actually get there. So we won't know how human lunar adaptations are going to be until we're on the moon. We're not going to really know how Martian adaptations are going to be until we're on Mars. But because humans are so good at adapting at a lot of places, we can use our existing data that we have to develop these models and kind of come up with a game plan of what is going to happen when we are in spaceflight, and then allow to build out some buffering for when things go sideways. We don't know what's going on. We can be like, maybe this is something we can anticipate. So let's talk a little bit about the human capability for adaptation and survival. If we want to talk about humans in space or on moons or on other planets, we first need to understand the capacity and ways in which humans can adapt. So we know that here on Earth, humans have successfully survived for extended periods of time, for like over generations, in a range of environments and ecosystems, from high altitude environments to desert environments to extreme cold, like in circumpolar regions like Siberia, to environments that are resource abundant. So they have lots of food, they have lots of water, but they are high with pathogenic and parasitic burdens. And so humans have managed to live in all of these conditions at varying degrees of success, but you can find humans almost anywhere. When we're thinking about the acclimatization and adaptation processes, what's important to note is that the ways in which people survive, whether it is short-term acclimatization, which is around in the 2-week period, or this longer-term adaptation, they have these three overarching characteristics. One is that these changes are going to be multifaceted. So you're never going to see just circulation increase, right? You're going to see circulation increase along with changes to the lung, along with changes to cognition, along with thermoregulatory changes. All of these things are going to be happening simultaneously. The second thing is that it occurs over different time scales. So I came from a high altitude background before I started doing spaceflight, and you can see, depending on how much time you've spent at high altitude, how much time your parents have spent at high altitude, how much time the population that you're from has spent at high altitude, you're going to see different adaptations over time. And the last thing is the specific environmental and social context. So we were talking about, for those of you who had jumped on a little bit early, Dr. Christensen and I have been talking about climate change and how the climates are rapidly changing. What previous generations may have adapted to in the past with extreme weather events, with climate changes, is going to be different. So the environmental and social context in which you are evaluating a subject, a patient, an individual, is going to make a big difference. It's going to be very important. So all of these factors are just as relevant in a spaceflight context as they are in other extreme environments. Ecological and social shifts at varying degrees of harshness and unpredictability shape everyday outcome and function, whether it's going to be at a high altitude location or a circumpolar or environmental or environments with high parasitic and pathogenic loads or spaceflight. So these characteristics become particularly important when you're thinking about what we know versus what we don't know about what's happening to the human body in these various contexts of spaceflight. Okay, so now I'm going to present here this conceptual model on thinking about how we can evaluate an individual in a spaceflight context. So how should we think about the human body in an extreme environment? So first we have this person. You'll see this is going to be my my little figure. He's going to come across in throughout the rest of the lecture. But if we have this individual, and each individual has various physiological and behavioral systems that are going to be interconnected and act on one another. And when you place the individual in any environment, such as the energetically demanding high altitude environment, they are going to be a series of potent stressors that the body needs to respond to. So we talked about high altitude before. Hypoxia is one. There is also a resource limitation. So you don't have access to nutrition, the kinds of nutrition that you would need. Cold. It's extremely cold if you are at a high altitude location and you're high enough that you're not having, you know, any warmth from oxygen, etc. So responding to these stressors, though, it is going to cost something. So what am I talking about when I'm saying cost? Here, in this case, it is energy. Energy is the currency of life. So I'm going to probably dating myself here, but in the immortal words of the Wu-Tang Clan, cash rules everything around me. In this case, we're talking about human functioning across a lifespan, and so energy is going to rule everything. Across the entire lifespan, you'll see that energy is going to be balanced between growth, reproduction, and maintenance. So these are the basic tenets of the ecological life history theory. If you're interested, want to do some more theoretical work, I recommend it. Life history theory is amazing, and it is often talked about across the entire lifetime. So you'll see life history theory brought up when they're talking about gestation periods. You know, why does an elephant have such long gestation period compared to a mouse? It's also talked about in terms of you know, populations that are living in really dangerous locations where there's a high chance of mortality, as opposed to locations where there's a very low chance of mortality. How are people balancing growth, reproduction, and maintenance across the lifespan? But even though these stressors are happening, or these trade-offs in response to these stressors are happening over the course of an individual's lifetime, when a stressor appears, it needs to be addressed, and your body is at every given moment making that decision of how it's going to be balancing this over time. Now, two of the systems that are critical to this process are neuroendocrine systems and metabolic energy expenditure. So this is how we're going to bring everything together. So like I said, because I'm an anthropologist, I'm coming from this evolutionary background, I of course love the, you know, arcane questions. What are the evolutionary implications of how energy is used across the life course? But it does become particularly important in an extreme environment where energy is spent every time you're responding to a stressor. And we know that there's this bidirectional relationship between hormones that are produced by the neuroendocrine system and energy expenditure. So I'm going to talk here about my favorite hormone. This is a hormone that I collect quite a bit. I have published some about this. I love cortisol deeply because it tells you so much about what is happening in the human body, but also it is an extremely stable hormone. It is a steroid hormone, and so you can collect it, sit it on a shelf for 2 weeks, and it still stays relatively good. So if we're doing extreme environment research, it's a really great hormone to be studying. Salivary cortisol, I should say salivary cortisol is really great. But when we're talking about cortisol, it plays an important role in determining how energy is allocated. So very simply, it acts as messengers that are telling the body what parts are going to need energy. It's a vast oversimplification of what cortisol does, but I'm sure this looks familiar to all of you as med students. I'm sure when you were in your pre-med track, you were looking at something like this, but we know that cortisol is produced to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which importantly works on the system of feedback loops. So it's responding to stressors in the environment. There are going to be these positive and negative feedback loops. So how you're spending your energy is in a negative feedback loop with overall hormone production. The more intensive activity that you're going to be doing, the more energy you're spending, the less energy can be diverted to things that don't matter. So reproduction or digestion. If you are in the woods and you see a snake and you need to get out of there, your body is not like, let's produce some eggs. Let's get ready to reproduce. That is not something that your body needs to be doing right now. So that allocation process is going to be happening every time you're encountering a stressor. Now, if we're talking about metabolic function, we know that cortisol is involved in organic metabolism and energy mobilization during stress. And its two major functions are that it's mobilizing physiological resources. So it's releasing glucose. I mean, that is the literal translation of glucocorticoid, right? It's releasing glucose and or signaling for the release of glucose. And it facilitates recovery from the sympathetic activation. So your fight or flight response. Now, what is also interesting is the social neuroendocrine function of cortisol. So it's also mobilizing psychological resources, alertness, vigilance, memory sensitization. There's a really great study, came out like in the mid 2000s maybe, that was talking about the when you're prepping to take a test, why practice tests are so important, because you're creating that scenario and you're increasing your cortisol levels, so your memory sensitization is increased, and so you do a little bit better, you're able to remember a little bit better. So pro tip for any exams that you have coming up, get a little stressed out and it will help a long way. But we know that increased cortisol is related to anxiety, social avoidance, subordinance, isolation. There's like a whole suite of really fantastic baboon studies done by Sapolsky and colleagues that are really foundational to the field, talking about isolation and social support. And we know that lower cortisol can be associated with decreased feelings of stress and social approach. So I will caveat that stress is like the most difficult, one of the most difficult terms I feel like used in the human biology medical lexicon, because there's so much slippage. Like, are we talking oxidative stress? Are we talking psychosocial stress? Are we talking social stressors? Are we talking environmental stressors? So this is just like a public service announcement. Be sure when you are talking about stress to do your best to clarify what kind of stress you're talking about, perceived stress, social stress, etc. Okay, let's go back to our fellow here. So if we're thinking about, you have your energy is your cash, that's how much you have within you, and you're experiencing these stressors from the environment. Theoretically, ideally, your cortisol is going up. You're experiencing the stressors, your cortisol is going up. It's like, okay, let's get things mobilized, let's deal with these stressors. Which could mean in this scenario that growth and reproduction, you don't really need to grow a couple inches right now. You're dealing with a stressor. Let's not worry about it. You don't need to be worrying about reproduction right now. Don't worry about it. Let's put some energy into maintenance. Let's make sure that we can get out of this situation, or we can, thermoregulate in a way that we can stay alive, right? Now, if you have adapted to this environment, say your cortisol is not as elevated. So in that case, perhaps the balance between growth, maintenance, reproduction stay relatively even. Now you have a child in a high altitude setting, they've adapted to that environment and they can grow and they're not stunted, and they are able to reproduce successfully. There's a wonderful suite of studies again in high altitude. I think high altitude is like one of the best studied groups of extreme environments. If you have any questions, you are interested in it, send me an email. I will send you these studies. It's very, very cool. But let's talk about translating this to spaceflight. This is a conceptual model that exists for extreme environment research. Why should we care about it for spaceflight? Okay, so this is a brief and by no means exhaustive overview of what happens in spaceflight in humans. And I'm going to be following the American model. This is a model that has been developed by the NASA's Human Research Program. I am unsure if it is kind of the same perspective that is taken globally. But the way that NASA, and specifically human research at NASA, divides the hazards of human spaceflight, and I will clarify here, human spaceflight, we can talk about robot spaceflight and drones and all of that stuff, but that is like not that interesting in my opinion. But humans is what we care about. NASA defines 5 hazards and then identifies the downstream effects of these hazards. So the first is gravity fields. And so gravity fields is not just experiencing microgravity. We're talking the full gambit here. So, you know, you go into space, you experience microgravity, then you go to the moon, you're experiencing a shift. Maybe, you know, though the moon is 1/6 of the gravity. So it's not just the fact that you're experiencing microgravity, Earth's gravity, and the moon's gravity. You're also experiencing all of these changes in these gravity fields. So we know that the changes in gravity fields affect spatial orientation, hand-eye coordination, balance, locomotion, bone loss, and massive fluid shifts. In fact, you get up to a 2-liter headward fluid shift. So like, you know, you see at maybe the gas station, the grocery store, those gigantic 2-liter bottles of soda. That is how much fluid goes into your head in a spaceflight setting. So then we have isolation and confinement. So like I said, I think I mentioned this earlier on, when we're talking about what the environment is, it is not just the ecological pressures of the environment, but it is what things are available to you. And yes, one thing that might be available to you is, you know, your favorite snacks, but the other thing that is available to you are your people. If you cannot contact your best friend, your mom, you can't go ahead and call like your doctor when you need something. Isolation and confinement has massive effects on the human body. We know that it's related to declines in mood, in cognition, morale, interpersonal interaction, but we also know that it's related to circadian rhythm dysfunction. On the ISS, you're experiencing 90-minute sunrise to sunset cycles while in orbit. And so we're seeing that kind of the circadian rhythm dysfunction that is coming from the changes in lightscape that you experience, and that is then augmented by the fact that you're isolated and you're stuck in one particular place. And finally, of course, nutritional deficiency. You're confined. It's not like you can go to the grocery store and go pick up more groceries when you're on the moon. So next we have hostile enclosed environments. So there's an easy transference of microbes and microorganisms from person to person. I recommend going on YouTube. There's some really weird videos on surface tension in a microgravity environment, because surface tension works a little bit differently. If you have a water droplet and it falls on your hand, it does not go splat or absorb into your skin. It just sits there. And so irritations can happen. I think the highest, you may have covered this already in your class, but like the highest incident of illness is like rash. It's like getting some sort of skin issue, and people just, you know, deal with it, but we don't know how big of an issue that's going to be for longer missions. We also know that there's stress hormone elevation and immune system alteration, including greater incidences of atopic dermatitis. So this is the skin reaction I was talking about. And then, of course, space radiation. I feel like this is, you know, the movies like to say that this is probably the most scariest and most important part of what's happening in human spaceflight. I would argue otherwise, but we do encounter more than 10 times the radiation than you experience here on Earth. And that is going to be related to damaged central nervous system, altered cognitive function, reduced motor function, behavioral changes. And most of these are coming out of animal models and are further extrapolated from to then be relevant to human models. But we know these are going to be issues. It's not going to be approved by your ethics committee to irradiate humans to test them for spaceflight, but based on what we've seen in animal models, we know that this will be an issue. And then finally, distance from Earth. So it's similar to isolation and confinement. We know that there's going to be communication delays, limited to no opportunities for resupply, psychological implications for being so far from home. And so when we're thinking about, like, if you are a human spaceflight scientist, okay, a human biologist like I am, our job is to look at all these different hazards and develop countermeasures to keep people alive and healthy. A lot of what's happening in human spaceflight from the research side is reactive. We are being like, okay, these are going to be issues, let's deal with them. But the move in spaceflight work, in space medicine, is to start to be proactive. What models can we build? What can we anticipate based on how humans are adapting in all of these different settings? What can we do to make sure that we are best preparing people to go into space, and then they can do whatever countermeasures are necessary? Okay, so we're back to our person. They're in this environment, they're experiencing stressors, but now let's move them to a spaceflight environment. So this is the inside of the International Space Station. As you can see, it is quite chaotic. For those of you who like a minimalism aesthetic, this is probably not a great place to be, but every single part of the vessel has to be used for something, right? And so when I said earlier that human spaceflight is this mixture of engineering and human health and performance, it really is. You have to be able to balance everything. Now, when we're thinking about the balance of growth, maintenance, and reproduction, thinking about energy as the currency, how are these different things moving, we really have not that much idea. So there are a series of new missions that are coming up to try and get folks to be in space for a longer period of time. You know, being in space for a short period of time versus a long period of time is going to be really different. We talked about timescale differences and adaptation, but to see things like growth, to see things like reproduction, we need people to be in space for long periods of time. And so things that might be related that we don't really understand: nutritional requirements. So if people are growing, or actually more likely they're not growing because they're conserving their energy to deal with other stressors that are happening in a spaceflight environment, how much food do they need? Food is really heavy. And so when we're talking about combining with the engineering, engineers are like, okay, how much food do you need? How heavy is it? Because all that weight that we could be using for water, or we could be using it for experiments, or we could be using it for fuel, do we have to balance it with food? All nutritional related weight on board. Possibility of gestation. There are all of these, like, sci-fi movies out there talking about the future spaceflight species. The show The Expanse, it's like one of my favorites. The science on it is great. I recommend it. But they talk about what it's like to be born and grow up on different planets, experiencing different gravity levels, experiencing, different access to resources. Do we even know what is going to happen? What is possible? There's really fantastic research on mice and rats, but we don't have any humans that are gestating in a microgravity environment. We don't know what's going to happen there. Along with that, juvenile human development. We know that in resource-deprived environments, in environments that are experiencing immense poverty or famine, we see that growth is really stunted. And so in a resource-scarce environment like a human spaceflight environment, but like on the moon, you're not getting your resources, not because they're maybe not available or you're not wealthy enough, but because the moon is pretty far away, and so it's limited how much resources you can get. Do we know anything about what juvenile development is going to be? Unknown. Long-term immune function. So we see these short-term changes that are happening with the skin, with rhinovirus, with herpes. There's like a reappearance of herpes that happens in spaceflight. But over a long period of time, what is the impact of that? What is the wear and tear of long duration immune dysfunction? How does that interact with maybe radiation when you've experienced quite a bit of radiation? So this is all to show that this is a really complicated problem. It's integrating biology, it's integrating medical risk, it's integrating engineering. And what is needed here is a systems approach. So this is an approach that many of my colleagues that are working in spaceflight are using and trying to put together. And there's a lot of really fantastic work out there that people are working on, but it's a hard problem, right? It's a hard problem being able to integrate everything and understand the different connections and feedback loops and how all of these things are connected. So just a couple of really good papers that are out there, great ideas that are out there. There's a contributing factor map by Jennifer Mindock and Dave Klaus. Dave Klaus is out of CU Boulder, but you can't really read anything on here, but you can see how all of these different boxes are things that are related to spaceflight, that are connected with each other. And the idea is that these different things are going to be connected to each other in different ways, and they're going to cause cascading effects. They're in a network, essentially. Now, a more recognizable network is the directed acyclical graphs, or DAGs, which is another project that's being worked on by Dr. Eric Antonsen and some of his colleagues, and he was for a very long time part of the NASA risk board. So specifically thinking about risk and thinking about, again, these cascading effects, feedback loops, how different things are connected with each other. When you're thinking about medical risk in space, you are never just thinking about one thing. You have to think about it in this larger systems perspective, much like most of medicine, but it becomes especially important when you are arguing with the engineer on the mission saying, I know that my person needs this much medication so they can deal with this particular problem, and the engineer is like, okay, well, we only have enough space for this much weight, and then can we keep it in the same location as this other drug? Is that going to cause some sort of weird reaction? So everything has to be thought of in the systems perspective. And so I like to finish with this photo just because it's like some of my favorite astronauts and personal heroes. So here we have Serena Anand-Chancellor on the extreme left, and Alexander Gerst and Anne McLean. So Serena and Anne are both American astronauts. Alexander is a German astronaut. So one of the really incredible things about the International Space Station and human spaceflight as a whole is that it is so international and so global. Everyone is able to come together and provide their various levels of knowledge, their support, to come together to push humanity into something greater and larger and more wonderful. But you can see here they're doing a series of medical experiments, and Serena is actually one of the most prominent physician astronauts in the American program, mainly because she does a lot of outreach work talking about the importance of medicine in space and how to translate it here on Earth. So as the future physicians of spaceflight, I just want to say that it's really important. My kind of takeaway note here is that it's really important to consider all of the variables. So what is really incredible about humans is that we really can make it work just about anywhere. But as we can see when we're looking at stress and metabolism, we adapt within a system that is highly sensitive to the space that we are in. And so with that, I just want to say a quick thank you to the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which pays my bills. And so, which is why I can talk to all of you here today. And of course, Hopkins Medicine and my really fantastic team at the Human Spaceflight Lab. And we can open things up for Q&A. So I'm going to close my screen and I'm going to hand it over back to you, Rowena.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful presentation. I just really love the perspective you took and the holistic approach that you took, and the way that integrates everything so beautifully. So thank you so much. I really, really loved it.
Thank you. Thank you. I realize it is a potentially unorthodox way of looking at it, but I have been heartened to see that at least within the human spaceflight community, unorthodox is good. Unorthodox means that we're finding new solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Lateral thinking and looking at things in fresh ways always comes up trumps in my opinion. Okay, all of you out there, it's your chance to ask as many questions as you would like. Marta, go for it.
Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting, and I love evolutionary biology, so it was really cool.
Amazing.
I was wondering, how would all of this research on stress and stress in extreme environments kind of translate to more everyday medicine, and does it translate to more everyday medicine?
That's a great question. So I think that in an extreme environment, you're seeing the most intense possibility because things are pushed to, like the highest limits or maybe the lowest limits, you're seeing kind of like the edges of what is possible. And so I think like a really good example is, again, high altitude, just because I've had so much experience working at high altitude. At high altitude, if you're thinking about interpersonal interaction, okay, and how interpersonal interaction is going to impact immune function, you're going to see that very, very clearly in a high altitude environment because the stakes are really high. People are pushed really, really hard in this extreme environment. They're, if they're fighting with someone on top of a mountain, it's probably going to be a pretty big fight. If they're really supporting each other on a really big mountain, they're really supporting each other. So you're seeing kind of, it's almost like seeing physiology in capital letters in an extreme environment. And so then you can go back and be like, okay, so like now in a more normal setting, when we're just walking around on the street, we can anticipate that these are how things are maybe connected with each other. We don't have to push people to the very edge to understand what's happening. But I think that, it's also interesting. I have this on my mind because I'm currently working on a special issue with a bunch of other biologists about extreme environment research, but understanding what extremes are. So for a long time, when people are thinking about extreme environments, they're thinking about, high altitude, hypoxia. Hypoxia is definitely an extreme. Human bodies are only meant to adapt to a certain level of oxygen. You start taking that away, we start acting very weird. Our bodies start shutting down. It's not a good time. Another thing might be extreme heat, the desert. I mean, if you are out in the Sahara Desert and you don't have water and you don't have a shade of any kind, you will die. Humans are really, really bad at adapting to heat, which is possibly why, climate change freaks me out so much and why I like to let's talk about this. Let's integrate it with spaceflight. Anyways, but something that, for example, being in the COVID pandemic, like you all are young, you were all in, college, and early med school while all of the pandemic things were happening. Social isolation is awful for human bodies. It's not just feelings of depression or feelings of anxiety that increase, but like our bodies start to fall apart because we know that psychosocial is very related to physio. We know that those things are going to be related. So changing the definition of extremes is also important. Things that we may have been like, this might be normal. Poverty is another example. This is like a normality that happens when you carefully examine what an extreme environment is, what it is that pushes people to the edges. We can better understand what everyday life maybe should be. Great question.
Thank you so much. Also, I have to go to another class, but I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So I talked a lot more than I anticipated. Apologies. Email me if you have to run to another class. Email me. We'll talk.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I also thought it was super fascinating. I just had a quick question about the atopic dermatitis you mentioned, because
Yes.
I know that flare-ups can be related to stress.
Yes.
So do you think that's one of the reasons why
So
we see that, or is it?
I think so. I definitely think so. There's so if you look up Brian Crucian, he is the NASA immunologist, or he works in the immunology lab. He is fantastic. He plays guitar. He's a really cool dude. But he has just published a couple of papers on the atopic dermatitis, and they're looking at cortisol levels, so looking at stress response levels. So they are elevated when people are stressed out. And people tend to be the most stressed out in a spaceflight launch, like during the launch period. Trained astronauts tend to find the actual mission to be pretty chill because they've spent all of their time training, getting ready to being on, on a mission. By the time they're actually on the mission, they're like, okay, I can just do my job. I can relax. Now, commercial astronauts or passengers, like people who have never experienced that, who have not trained, we don't really have their data yet, so we don't really know. And so it's likely that their atopic dermatitis that would happen in a spaceflight setting would likely be elevated. For astronauts, right now the data is, we're not seeing a very clear connection, but because, like you said, terrestrially, we see that there's this relationship, it's likely that for people who find flying to be really stressful, find being in a spaceflight environment really stressful might have elevated reactions. Good thinking. Okay, we can fit one more question. We can do one more.
Yeah, I've just got a quick question.
Yes.
I'm wondering, so if like, because you've looked at so many other extreme environments, if you take someone and put them in that environment permanently, does that lead to like more morbidity and mortality?
That's that is such a fantastic question. Okay, so this goes back to the question of timelines and the specifics of the environment that you're in. So depending on the exposure and the individual and like what prior life experience they had, people are going to be better or worse at adapting to a situation. And so if they are better, it might not necessarily mean that they have higher levels of morbidity and mortality. If they are maybe like their developmental trajectory has put them in a slightly worse position, they might have higher morbidity and mortality. The problem with this is that from a biology perspective and an ecological perspective, you can only make these assumptions based on populations. You just like don't have enough people to be able to tell you, okay, people are going to do really well or they're not going to do really well. But in spaceflight, there's just have been so few people, we don't actually know if we're going to see a big population shift in people who are doing well or not. It's a very unsatisfying answer, but there's so much variation. Sometimes it'll be really bad. Other times people do generally well. But if you continue to study that topic, you will be a very big deal in human spaceflight because that's resilience and that's what everyone is interested in right now.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. And
Well,
I think we are at time. I don't want to keep all of you over. I know you must have classes to get to.
Well, thank you so much. It's just been an absolute joy and privilege to have you with us today and to have such a wonderful presentation and all those really interesting questions and answers. So thank you once again. If we can all please say a very big thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me. And like I said, if you have more questions, feel free to send me an email. You can follow me on Twitter. I tweet about space things mainly, sometimes about cats. And if you are interested in joining our international group of spaceflight scientists, medical professionals, industry professionals, talk to Dr. Christensen. She can give you the link or go to our website. And Journal Club will be starting in a couple weeks. So hope to see some of you there. Have a great day, y'all.
Thanks so much. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you so much.